This was hidden in plain sight the whole time, not the story. Everyone knows about Noah and the ark, but what they don't tell you is what happened before. The decades of mockery, the daily humiliation, the slow erosion of reputation while doing exactly what God told him to do. And today, before you quit because no one understands what you're building, I want to show you something. Obedience without applause is the highest form of faith. I want to take you to a moment that changes everything when you see it clearly. God told Noah to build an ark. Massive, unprecedented, in a world that had never seen rain. And Noah started building, not after God gave him a sign, not after people believed him, not after it made sense. He just started. And here's what nobody talks about. Noah built that ark for decades. Some scholars say 60 years. Others say 120. Either way, that's not a weekend project. That's a lifetime of waking up, picking up tools, and working on something everyone around you thinks is insane. Listen carefully. Noah didn't have a support group. He didn't have a community of believers cheering him on. He didn't have social media validation. He had God's word. And that had to be enough. Because everything else, his neighbors, his reputation, common sense, was telling him to stop. Do you know what that feels like? To be doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing and have everyone think you're crazy? To be obedient and be called delusional? To be building something significant while people laugh and ask when you're going to get serious about life? That's not just discouraging. It's destabilizing because humans need validation. We're wired for it. We want to know we're on the right track. And when everyone is telling you you're wrong, even when you know you heard from God, doubt creeps in. Not loud doubt, quiet doubt, the kind that whispers, what if they're right? What if I misheard? What if I'm wasting my life? If today you're building something and no one understands it, write this. God's approval is the only validation I need, even when it's the only validation I have. Noah wasn't just building wood and pitch. He was building in isolation. Because obedience to an uncommon calling creates uncommon loneliness. Your old friends don't understand anymore. Your family thinks you've changed. And the new people who should get it haven't shown up yet because what you're building isn't finished. And in that gap, between leaving what was familiar and arriving at what's promised, you're alone. Not because God abandoned you, but because pioneering is lonely. Because no one can walk a path with you that they can't see. Here's the point. If your obedience makes sense to everyone, you're probably not obeying God. You're obeying culture. Because God's instructions rarely align with popular opinion. They challenge it, confront it, sometimes completely contradict it. Think about Abraham. God told him to leave everything familiar and go to a land he'd never seen. No map, no guarantee. Just, I'll show you when you get there. And Abraham went, but nobody went with him. His father started the journey, but died halfway. Lot came, but eventually separated. Sarah was there, but didn't always understand. Abraham walked most of that journey essentially alone with God. And that's the pattern. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before God called him. Alone. Joseph spent 13 years in slavery and prison. Alone. David was anointed king, but spent years in caves hiding from Saul. Alone. Paul was in Arabia for 3 years after his conversion before he started ministry. Alone. The pattern is clear. God isolates before he elevates. Not as punishment, as preparation. Because if you can't obey when no one is watching, you can't handle the pressure of everyone watching. And this is the hardest part. The isolation isn't just external. It's internal. Because when you're obeying God against all logic, you start questioning yourself. Am I prideful for thinking I heard from God? Am I stubborn? Am I delusional? Maybe I should listen to the people who love me and think I'm making a mistake. Stop for a second. What has God told you to do that you've been second-guessing because no one else confirms it? Noah faced something most people never talk about: societal mockery. Not just disagreement. Mockery. People walking by his construction site daily, laughing, making jokes, asking when the rain was coming, calling him a fanatic, a fool, probably questioning his mental health. And Noah couldn't defend himself with evidence. He couldn't show them rain. It had never rained. He couldn't prove a flood was coming. All he had was, God told me. into a world that hadn't experienced what he was preparing for. That sounded insane. That's the cost of obedience. You can't prove you're right until after you're vindicated. And vindication doesn't always come quickly. Sometimes it takes decades. And in those decades, you have to live with people thinking you're wrong. Most people can't handle that. So they adjust. They compromise. They build a smaller arc, a more reasonable one that makes sense to others. And they call it wisdom. But it's not wisdom. It's fear. Fear of looking foolish. Fear of being alone. Fear that maybe they really did hear wrong. But Noah didn't adjust, didn't compromise, didn't build a smaller version to make people comfortable. He built exactly what God told him to build, to the exact dimensions, with the exact materials, even though it seemed excessive, even though it seemed unnecessary. Because obedience isn't about making sense. It's about doing what you were told. Here's what No 1 tells you. The size of what God calls you to build will often seem disproportionate to your current reality. It will feel too big, too ambitious, too expensive, too time-consuming, and everyone will tell you to scale it down. But if God said build at that size, build at that size. Because he sees what's coming. You don't. I think about Joseph when he was in prison. He interpreted dreams for the cupbearer and the baker. The cupbearer was restored to his position, and Joseph asked him, "Remember me when it goes well with you." And the cupbearer forgot. For 2 years, 2 more years in prison after doing something good, after using his gift, after being faithful. That's the reality of obedience. It doesn't always produce immediate results. Sometimes you do the right thing and things get harder. Not better, harder. And you have to decide, do I obey because I expect reward? Or do I obey because God is God and that's enough? Noah obeyed for decades without reward, without rain, without vindication, just hammering, sawing, building, day after day, year after year, while people laughed, while opportunities passed him by, while others built normal lives, and he built an impossible boat. And during those decades, what was God doing? Testing, not Noah's ability to build, Noah's ability to trust. Because anyone can obey when it makes sense, when people support you, when you see progress. But to obey when it seems pointless, when no one believes you, when there's no evidence you're right, that's faith that gets God's attention. Today, identify one thing God told you to do that you've been modifying to make it more acceptable to others. And commit to doing it his way, not theirs. There's another layer here that's critical. Noah wasn't just building for himself. He was building for people who didn't exist yet. Future generations who would survive because he obeyed. But he never met them, never got thanked by them, never saw their lives. That's the nature of pioneering obedience. You're building for people you'll never meet, planting trees you'll never sit under, creating pathways you'll never walk. And that can feel unrewarding because humans want to see impact, want to know it mattered, want validation that the sacrifice was worth it. But some obedience is too significant for immediate gratification. It requires you to trust that God is using your faithfulness in ways you can't see and won't experience. And that's okay, because your obedience isn't about you. It's about God's plan. And his plan is always bigger than your lifespan. Think about Moses. He led Israel for 40 years in the wilderness, dealt with their complaining, their rebellion, their constant doubt. And when they finally reached the promised land, God told Moses, "You're not going in." Moses could only see it from a distance. After 40 years of sacrifice, he didn't get to experience the promise. That seems cruel, unfair. But Moses understood something most people don't. Obedience isn't transactional. It's relational. He didn't obey to get the land. He obeyed because God asked him to. And at the end, when he died on that mountain, he died knowing he'd been faithful. And that was enough. Write this where you'll see it. My obedience is not about my reward. It's about his glory. And that's enough. Noah had another challenge nobody mentions, the dailiness of it. It's one thing to obey in a moment of inspiration. It's another thing to obey every single day for decades when inspiration is gone, when it's just routine, when the work is tedious, when progress is slow, when nothing about it feels spiritual anymore. That's where most people quit. Not in the dramatic moments, in the boring ones. When obedience feels like drudgery. When you're doing the same thing you did yesterday and would do tomorrow. When there's no miracle, no breakthrough, just work. But that's where character is built. Not in the exciting beginning, not in the celebrated ending. In the middle, in the grind, in the dailiness of showing up when no one is watching and doing what you're supposed to do even though you don't feel like it. Because feelings are terrible leaders. They change with circumstances, with moods, with opinions of others. But obedience grounded in conviction doesn't need feelings. It just needs commitment. And commitment says, I'll do this whether I feel like it or not, whether it makes sense or not, whether anyone cares or not. Here's the truth that hurts. If you're waiting to feel like obeying before you obey, you'll never do anything significant. Because significant obedience rarely feels good in the moment. It feels costly, uncomfortable, lonely, and those feelings are real. But they're not facts. The fact is, God told you to do it, and that overrides how you feel about it. I remember Gideon. God called him to lead Israel against the Midianites. And Gideon had every excuse. I'm the least in my family. My family is the weakest in our tribe. I'm nobody. All true, but irrelevant. Because God wasn't calling him based on qualification. He was calling him based on assignment. And when Gideon asked for signs, God gave them. Multiple signs. But even after the signs, Gideon was afraid. The Bible says he attacked the enemy camp at night because he was afraid to do it during the day. But he still attacked. Afraid, but obedient. And God gave him victory. You don't have to be brave to obey. You just have to move. Afraid, but moving is still obedience. Doubtful, but building is still faithfulness. Lonely, but continuing is still trust. Noah probably woke up many mornings afraid, doubting, wondering if he'd wasted his life. But he still picked up his tools, still went to the construction site, still hammered another plank. And that consistency in the face of doubt is what made him a man of faith. Take the next hour and do one thing you've been avoiding because you're afraid of what people will think. Just start. Afraid but moving. There's one more thing about Noah that's critical. He didn't just build an ark. He preached. The Bible calls him a preacher of righteousness. He was building and warning people. This is coming. Get ready. Turn to God. And nobody listened. Nobody. That's devastating. To work for decades. To warn people. To offer them the same salvation you're preparing. And have every single person reject it. That's not just isolation. That's grief. Because Noah wasn't building alone by choice. He was building alone because everyone else chose not to join him. And here's what that means for you. Sometimes your obedience will expose others' disobedience. And they'll resent you for it. Not because you're judging them, but because your faithfulness highlights their lack of it. And instead of changing, they'll try to get you to stop, to quit, to come back down to their level. And you have to decide, do I adjust to their comfort? Or do I stay faithful to God's call? Because you can't do both. You can't obey God and please everyone. And when you choose obedience, some people will leave. Some will mock. Some will misunderstand. And that will hurt. But it's the cost. Write the name of one person whose opinion has been holding you back from full obedience. And decide today, God's voice matters more. I come back to you, to your morning, to that thing you've been building that no one understands, to that calling you've been questioning because the isolation is overwhelming. Today I want you to hear this. Noah didn't see rain for decades, but he kept building, not because he saw results, but because he heard from God, and that was enough. You don't need everyone to understand. You don't need validation from your peers. You don't need approval from your family. You need to know you heard from God. And if you did, then build. Even if you build alone, even if they laugh, even if it takes longer than you thought, build. Because one day, what you're building will make sense. Not to you first, to God first, and then, eventually, to everyone who doubted. But by then, you won't need their validation anymore. Because you'll have learned that God's approval is the only approval that sustains you when everything else falls apart. May this morning not be another day of second-guessing. May it be the day you decide, I'm done editing God's instructions to make them comfortable for others. I'm building what He told me to build, to the size He specified, with the materials he requires. No compromises, no shortcuts, no scaling down. And if I build alone, I build alone. Because the God who gave me the blueprint will be with me while I build it. And when it's done, it won't matter who laughed. It will only matter that I obeyed. And that obedience will save more than just me. It will create pathways for people I'll never meet. And that legacy is worth more than any applause I could get today. Amen.